All right, thanks everyone for joining us. We've got Edward Farrell doing a presentation on rethinking training and certification. As always, at the end, we'll do questions at the end, so please submit them through the app. Please give it up for Edward.
Thanks for the introduction, Billy, and yeah, thank you for having me here again. This is now, I think, my 7th year or 6th year at AusCERT. I think I lost count after 3, but no, wonderful to be here. My name's Edward Farrell. I run a cybersecurity practice called Mercury. I've been pen testing for 12 years. I've been running Mercury for the last 7, both as a consultant, but and doing delivery, and now overseeing a team that flexes anywhere from 10 to 20, depending on the time of year. But on top of that, I also lecture at the Australian Defence Force Academy. I also do random, weird and wonderful bits of training around the place as well. So I do play in a number of different areas. So what I'm going to be going through today is, I think first and foremost, it's important just to define a little bit of the problem space that I'm observing in cybersecurity and how we train and qualify personnel. On top of that, I'll also have a bit of a look at, well, how did we used to do this? And then what are some of the things that we're starting to see now? And hopefully we can start to get to a bit of a didactic towards the end of, well, this might be the path that will help us deal with some of the issues we're having with building and developing a workforce, but also doing one that actually has some meaningful outcomes to it. And so I think first and foremost, in terms of defining our workspace, I think it's important to take a step back from what we know as cybersecurity and also what we know from training and education, and come back to more of the economics considerations around what cybersecurity is. And so if we look at this and define it a little bit, it's coming back to how do we meet the demand for cybersecurity personnel based on requirements, well, how do we meet that demand for cybersecurity personnel? And one of the ways that we've actually seen this problem get solved recently has been a big drive towards industry certifications, leveraging more sort of project management style activities and more sort of repeatable actions that we can quickly indoctrinate someone with in a matter of weeks and suddenly create a cybersecurity professional. What's actually even worse about this, however, is we're focusing quite heavily on knowledge regurgitation and multiple choice questions as an indicator of capability, which makes a lot of sense in industries where we have repeatable, reproducible systems and processes, where we may not necessarily have a need for analytical ability, and also environments where we've actually got a well-formed body of knowledge. And then on top of that, something else to be cognizant of is we're having to layer on top of this an environment where malice is almost one of the driving factors. So for me, one of the points I hammer home of is, yep, we can make these individuals that are capable of knowledge, but in terms of practice and undertaking certain activities that we need them to, in terms of what cybersecurity actually needs, there's a bit of a disconnect that's been occurring. And so on top of that, we also have a bit of a Dunning-Kruger effect coming on, which is the idea that knowledge, skills, or prior competence is the only indicator of ability. And so we have off the back of this an overconfidence in an area that people may not necessarily entirely understand, or we have a confidence that isn't necessarily backed by capability. And this has a cyclical event and cycle behind it, which I'll talk to a little bit later when we look at some of our historical examples around how this has played out in other technical domains. And then, yeah, I think for me, there's complexity to this that is often really best explained by memes. And so this was one I displayed, if any of you saw my talk back in 2020, is that because of economics and some of the commercial interests that are pushing cybersecurity, we often find that a path to least resistance is still preferable, both in terms of our supporting workforce, but individuals that we have conducting a lot of our activities. And so this means that doing a certification bootcamp without taking the time and effort to understand what it is you're learning and jumping immediately to a place where you're meant to be delivering some level of competence or capability within 2 weeks of sitting a certification does present a bit of a risk. So this sees individuals start going through a process of chasing certifications over trying to do a professional development of themselves. And unfortunately, the commercial environment drives this, which I think if you have a look at my talk on the formation of security operations centers in 2020, for me, in addition to the commercial aspect of it and the fact that we had seen a lot of the SOCs that we assessed have lots of layers that weren't really delivering anything, I think that's also another aspect that informs that. That also then starts driving people down that certification path, because that's what's used to push people through. And I think this also comes back to how we in the West nowadays measure ability. And a lot of this comes back to how we're trying to present ourselves and represent ourselves. For example, one of the ones that always entertains me is the idea that CH, a 125 multiple choice question, is now a measurement of competence for being, as the certification suggests, of being a certified ethical hacker, even though there is no actual hacking done in the certification. On top of that, things such as job titles and our outward personality has greater influence on us being employed, or that's what we perceive, over who we are and who we build ourselves out and how we build out our staff. And so certification was kind of meant to fix this and have that indicator of competence, but factoring in the economic and commercial considerations I discussed before, it's now sort of driven into an environment where there's a big push just purely to driving certification for no other means than financial value. So this was a bit of a meme that I'd been going through over a couple of months last year, where I was convincing, has anyone here had an annoying LinkedIn message about getting certified as an ISO 27001 lead auditor? 1, 2, 3. I'm seeing a few heads and smiles nod. Thankfully, I wasn't looking for that. I was actually looking to become a certified dolphin trainer in AWS. A lot of them I managed to pull their legs for a couple of hours and entertain myself in my spare time to see if they could help me get certified as a dolphin trainer. And so herein lies the problem. So for everyone's reference, this is not a real certification. This is, for me, this was just an indicator of how ludicrous some of the systems and processes that were pushing people towards certification training we're getting. There's also a lot of criticism on the internet about some of these certifications, the companies that are running them, the fact that you can become certified without having any ground in any knowledge or capability, and yet the certification can be tacked onto the bottom of your resume, and suddenly there's every chance that without any validation you'll be able to gain employment as an ISO lead auditor, maybe a dolphin trainer if that's what they're looking for. But it got to a point where, or it is now at a point where this drive to certification, especially security certification, is seeing this market pop up, and I don't really think it's helping us at all. So the reality is that there's a lot of similarity between where we're seeing certification in our industry compared to what we started to see with the MCSE group of certifications, which were retired 2 years ago. There's a lot of similarity between the MCSE and what we're seeing in the certification environment now. And one of the problems that we saw, especially in the early 2000s, was individuals would sit a cramming session through a training provider, and then suddenly they would be an MCSE certified engineer, off the back of which they could be dropped into a six-figure salary in the 2000s, which before the inflation of current year was actually quite good. But my own experience when I was working in a NOC was I found myself actually having to troubleshoot issues for a lot of these MCSE certified engineers who didn't know how to install Windows, or couldn't work out that their mouse wasn't plugged in properly. And so this started to turn into a case of, well, we had certified people that were delivering billable work that just weren't quite prepared for it. Now you compare that to other teams I'd worked with, a collective corporate environment and a body of knowledge building out did a lot more in terms of getting our staff to a level of competence than an actual certification. And I think for me, whilst I understand the need for certification, my experience then always made me cast a little bit of doubt about how effective our certification environment always was. I think this has kind of popped up again, which has driven this talk. So if we go back even further, how did we avoid shortfalls around certification and qualification? My favourite one is always looking at medieval craft guilds. Now, once again, economics was very much the focus of a lot of these organisations, but so was reputation. That is, if you were a member of a guild for a particular craft, such as stonemasonry, for example, you wanted a high quality reputation for all of your operators within the realm. Now, another factor of this as well was a little bit more Machiavellian, which was, of course, that you would be doing wise wage and price regulation or effectively wage fixing, so that skills would be maintained at a certain level, but also so that you'd be able to generate a level of wealth. It also meant that there was a limit on knowledge and also requirements for entry, which you could argue is both a good and bad thing. For me, I think it does mean that we get to ensure that we get people to a higher quality, but by that same token, we could also miss out on some talent. There was also supporting this idea that you had a workforce structure that saw you develop and learn on the job from an apprentice up to a place of being a master craftsman, which, if you have a look at some of our professional associations today, we see some learnings around this, especially with some of our industry trades, for example. So things such as apprenticeships in plumbing, carpentry, just to name a few. The British Navy also had the same issue in the 19th century. That is, you have a system and a service that is expensive, powerful, and critical to maintaining wealth. Your ship's captains and your leadership on board a ship also needed to operate with limited context and also guidance. Your officers needed to be prepared without Wikipedia, and so an officer or midshipman at the time would spend almost 6 to 7 years on board a ship, building out key lessons and competencies under the direction of the ship's captain to become competent officers in a period of 6 years. And you'd then have to face a very rigorous exam, or you'd be moved on from the Navy. But in this case, that onboard ship's learning created an experiential environment. You're also providing output for the ship. But also there was direct consequences of not meeting a set standard, which in an environment at the time that was so critical to the expansion of the British Empire was important. And I think sometimes the idea of not yet competent can mean that we can sustain people for an extended period, even though they don't necessarily meet the standards that we're trying to get them to. But my favourite example of all of this is perhaps more around how we've developed and created general practitioners and healthcare professionals since the 19th century. So this probably sounds a little bit familiar. Is in the USA in the 1950s, to become a licensed doctor, you just pay $5, have a couple of classes over 4 months that you didn't really need to attend. You might get a tick at the end and then be sent on your way to do things such as bloodletting or chopping limbs for the sake of it. And if you wanted to actually be really good and really competent, that was something that you did in your own time. There wasn't the imposition on you to do anything besides enroll in a course and get a certificate at the end. Of course, in the 1860s, we had the US Civil War, and the doctors that were generated in the 1850s and earlier through a 4-month exam, 4 months of training that you didn't need to turn up to, didn't necessarily perform to the level that one would hope you would in a civil war. So the experiences of the US Civil War and then the evolution of the economic environment from the 1870s onward during the Reconstruction period saw a big push in academic institutions to actually build out the body of knowledge in this place. They also had learnings from Europe as well. but there was a greater emphasis on having an underlying academic qualification prior to actually becoming qualified as a doctor. There was also the view that, hey, you actually needed experience, not just theory, to become useful in your job. And so what we started to see in the 1910s onwards was the creation of medical interns, which over time saw a high quality general practitioner evolve, which then developed over time into what we now know as our GPs and our doctors today. Now, the problem we have is that the commercial environment now means that, so I live in Sydney, a GP makes a substantial less amount of money than being a plastic surgeon. Plastic surgeon also probably has better hours as well than a GP, and is dealing with things that probably are a little less stressful. So it's one of these peculiarities that the commercial environment now means that being a plastic surgeon is more commercially viable than being a general practitioner. It's interesting, Nick Elsmore wrote an article 12 years ago where he looked at this problem that we now have in cybersecurity and technology generally, where we're actually pushing for more brain surgeons in our industry as opposed to just general practitioners to deliver services. And so that commercial imperative can also throw us off as part of our environment of developing people. Is we can have this view of, yep, we just need to turn everyone into a surgeon. That may not always necessarily be the most effective path. And we've actually seen that also occur in the US medical system as well, where heart surgery, which generates a lot more income, is viewed and advocated more favourably than preventative medicine and actually looking after yourself. So let's fast forward to a bit of now and where we're seeing the community actually respond as a result of some of the weaknesses I discussed earlier. So we have actually seen a community response over the last 5 or 6 years in terms of generating reliable training. Sec Talks, for those of you who have attended around Australia, had spawned itself originally. If you go back 20, 25 years, you had the old 2600 communities, some of which still exist, which then evolved into RuxCon, which then evolved into the Platypus initiative in 2016 down in Sydney, which then evolved into Sec Talks, which was spawned in Sydney as a meetup with a focus on hands-on technical training. The early days of that were, let's just do CTFs and use that to develop capability, which then turned into very large social events. Same B-Sides was spawned in 2011 in Las Vegas. And once again, the concern here was from a community level was that Black Hat was not accepting speakers that were of high quality, but not necessarily high commercial value. Then we've seen offshoots from this, such as tons of overseas instances of Sec Talks and B-Sides, software-defined radio meetups, and even other small social events. So this collaborative and more freewheeling event has kind of come about because there has been an absence of hands-on technical experiential training. And this really does come back to as well, there's no economic incentive a lot of the time to deliver that. If you had a look at my items that I was talking about before, the experience, the experiential learning is high risk, but also to deliver and generate, but also it means that you don't have a repeatable, reproducible process that you can continue charging after you've generated your content. So what do we need to be doing as an industry in response to this? So as I highlighted before, this idea of a portal, a quiz, a couple of slides to click through is great from an economic standpoint, but we don't necessarily reach the outcome that we need. That is, we're trying to create professionals that we can throw into an absolutely chaotic environment that can adequately respond to the environment that is there. We're also constantly thinking about this idea of an end state certification, which is you sit your exam and that's the end of it, as opposed to a lifelong learning environment, and especially in our professional industries. And a lot of the time this almost has to be driven by the individual. And so this point-in-time certification does pose that risk. So how do we fix that part? I think a lot of it will also come back to what I call outward projection versus inward introspection, which is the Instagram model approach of cybersecurity certification, where the outward presentation of being certified, as opposed to, hey, I'm actually thinking about this myself and developing myself and growing myself. That almost, that self-reflection process is something that we do need to oscillate back to as a community, and this is almost a societal and cultural thing that we need to promote. So what are some of the ways that we can generate this? So this is the subject I've been teaching at the Australian Defence Force Academy now for the last 5 years, which is the postgraduate course on wireless cybersecurity. You'll see a little antenna in the bottom there, and everyone has their antennas stuck up listening to traffic that we're generating using a software-defined radio. Some of my early failures around this, though, were I did start creating a judgmental environment similar to what I was used to in high school, which realistically the reaction, I think, really spoke for itself, which is people aren't here for that. And I think this was a big learning lesson when I was trying to create an environment to build people out. There's a desire to have a bit of contention and to actually set a standard, but imposing that on someone in a very good versus evil way can actually be counterproductive. Another issue I did have as well, which was a bit of feedback, was came back to that economics aspect, which is what do our staff to student ratios look like, which the university had adapted to. And I come back as well to this idea of outward projection. A lot of students had sustained this idea of, I need a high distinction, and I think this comes back as well to our secondary and tertiary education systems here in Australia, which is we really promote this idea of you need a UAI of X, or you're not worthy, or you need to have high distinctions because that's the only way you're ever going to have a good job. And so for a lot of students, this created a lot of stress and pressure for them. And so if you ever come into my class, it's one of the expectations I do set up front. It's, folks, as an employer, I really don't care about what numerical value is set. I care about your desire to learn and to grow yourself over time. And I think that's an expectation thing that, as educators, we need to set. I also got to a point of belt feeding slides, which if you did my threat modeling class on Tuesday, one of the points I drew upon was, all right, it's over to you to actually learn yourself. If a lecturer is just belt feeding slides with the hope that you're actually sucking it all in, statistics show I think people only absorb about 10% from actually reading slides. So if there's anything you take away from today, from me belt feeding you slides, it's belt feeding slides may not necessarily be the most effective way to educate you. Excellent, I've got everyone's attention. We're back. So one of the solutions to this is what we call creating non-emotional stimuli to mastery, which is students start focusing on the process over the outcome. And that outcome will lead to an eventual reward, but that's off the back of mastering a particular skill. CTF challenges are a good example of this, but I also feel like CTF challenges have gone off on their own tangent and been a system in of themselves, which kind of means that we need to get back to people doing what I call so what analysis. If you can achieve something in a particular cybersecurity environment, what does this mean? Where does this apply contextually in your world? And I think one of the other curiosities I see, and I saw it a lot with some of the research about 10 or 15 years ago, was there was a lot of people demonstrating local privilege escalation vulnerabilities in systems where you'd never be able to get local access. It's just like, yeah, there's a lot of mitigating controls around this. Everybody needs to probably relax about some of these bugs that keep getting found and registered. And so a Socratic process of just posting students so what aids with this, as well as helping students with writing and articulation, which is still quite relevant, especially when we're tweeting our opinions. We're still using emails and we're still using PDF reports to generate knowledge. And so I'll talk a little bit later about the necessity of what I call an effective grounding and background knowledge, which is a little bit outside of my discipline and domain, but I think it's an important consideration. A really cool example of this was a training activity I generated for the Australian Defence Force and their Cyber Skills Association. This was an event that we called the Black Bag. Students would be chucked into a room in 15 minutes, so think an escape room, and there were multiple challenges ranging from lockpicks to dumping files off a bunch of little devices through to getting paper organised in such a way that they'd be able to stitch together a couple of messages and QR codes. And it was interesting, right? You'd throw two students in, you'd get them playing through their dynamic. Sometimes it worked, sometimes one student would dominate the other. Sometimes they wouldn't think through time and space appreciation as well. And so there were students that, quite frankly, got no challenges and won absolutely nothing. But they left realising, here's all this stuff I don't know. And the appreciation of time pressure as well was also a really big driver that for some of the students, they walked away from this realising, okay, here's some skills that I need to develop, but also here's how I'm going to do this differently next time. And so that self-appreciation process of where did I go wrong in that 15-minute period and how would I do it better next time really came out as part of that process. So fast forward to 2021, and this was a little challenge we built on an ESP32. If anyone would like the code for this, or even some of the slides and videos, do reach out to me after this talk. But we created a challenge that focused on introducing participants to radio frequencies, Bluetooth, and 802.11. And then it started evolving into a smorgasbord of all these weird and wonderful challenges that were actually quite flexible in terms of how you'd solve them. So there was also an AM radio that was modulating off a GPIO pin that some students managed to get. Others had to rig up their own antennas. Others had to put it as close to their car as possible. And then it also turned into a bit of analysis. So we also had a bit of a story going on the devices as well. So we also looked at the haversack ruse that supported the charge of the Australian Light Horse at Beersheba, and how that information operation contributed to a wider effect. And we had a look at all of these historical occurrences within the Australian Defence Force over the last 120 years of things such as deception, electronic warfare, and cyber events that were all just on this little board. So it also turned into a bit of a history lesson as well as a technical lesson. One of my favourite ones on this, though, was the blinky light on the Kangaroo Eye. That was a Morse code message. The Navy guys, who are all engineers, decided to, instead of reading 2 minutes of a blinking light delivering a Morse code message, they decided to rig it up to, I think, an oscilloscope, I think it was, and then just record the data and then translate it on computer. So instead of burning 2 hours, I think they completed that challenge in about 15 minutes. But it was that case of, here's an alternative way to think things. It's not the right answer if you were looking at this in a multiple choice question, but they still got to a much more efficient, much more effective answer. And those are the sort of individuals that we want to be creating in Australia and in cybersecurity. On top of this, if you went to the threat modeling course I delivered on Tuesday, gamification and turning things into a card game is another way where we can, revisit that approach of what I think sustained most of us in our childhood, which is we learned a lot of our best lessons in a playground. So why don't we take games out again? And so it's a very expedient process, but it also created a very sound path to appreciating what the problem was, as opposed to a management consultant telling you all of your problems. We also had a brand new security analyst who was in our tutorial on Tuesday, who came out with all these wonderful ideas. Now, if this was just a consultation process from a consulting firm, some of those good ideas probably wouldn't have been received. And just the exchange of knowledge and thoughts that came out of this were great. But once again, it comes back to a baseline of knowledge that we still need to hit. There also needs to be awareness of your own cognitive biases, and unfortunately in Australia, we, being the sporting nation we are, we can often have a desire to win, and people have to win arguments, like they have to win arguments on Twitter. I don't know why. And so we don't really get to a good outcome if that's the case. And that's, I think, just one of those cautionary tales when we look at how we train and grow people is getting away from this idea of win at all costs. So how did Mercury and my team and I re-engineer some of this? We had an awesome process around self-directed learning, but our biggest issue around our SDL process was, once again, baseline knowledge and competency. And on top of that, it was self-directed, which for an apprentice can be a little bit difficult. And so for us, there was a need for mentorship as part of that. We have been looking at certain forms of certification as a solution, but I think the more effective path that we identified was a down tools research week once every 8 weeks, which is really focusing on professional practice and then taking training activities from observed weaknesses, which, look, in the time after COVID, we've gotten rid of our offices. We have this wonderful budget that we can now use to take staff up to the Gold Coast or wherever to actually do that professional growth and development. And so for us, whilst we work online and work on the internet, we've now got a really great path to collaborate face-to-face. I also have started looking at some of our organisational structures, and this is where I looked at the medieval craft guilds, is that we can create these environments to help build people. And so where does this lead to when we look at on-the-job certification? I think this is ultimately where we want to be moving towards, is some semblance of vocational training that take us through this path that I demonstrated in the training activities I had before, where people grow into a point where they have that level of competency that we've validated through on-the-job activities. This gives us a better path in our CTF approach, as well as a lot of our certifications, which is that the capability needs to integrate with other effects. We also have other weaknesses around this as well, which is the system we have around skills and qualification in Australia. I find, from my experience in surf lifesaving, is actually quite dogmatic and dependent on on Word documents, and doesn't really cater to us from a grey zone standpoint. So something I'm playing out, but same with how do we do creative thinking as well in this space, which comes back to this thing I was talking about the baseline level skills that we need to generate for that. Now, do we generate that through our current university system? I think a concern I have is that compared to Europe and continental Europe, we don't have the vocational universities that you see in places like Germany. Most of our universities are focused on a more academic approach, which is fantastic, but I think sometimes there can be that disconnect from a vocational state, and that may need to go through a bit of a heavy crossover as well. But even before we get here, I think there's things that we need to think about before we look at training and certification. Underlying skills, so most of us here, I'm sure, are tertiary educated, or at least have completed high school, have competencies around language, literacy, numeracy. Everyone here understands what a clock is because most of you turned up to my talk on time. Some of those skills are actually absent when we look outside a Western environment and a Western mindset. So they're things that we need to look at in terms of growing our youth. The other thing as well that I'm cognizant of is underlying psychological conditioning. So I talked about this outward approach of everyone has to know how awesome I am. And for me, that's, I think, one of the great dangers we have in this industry. It's how we're going to have catalysts for insider threat events. It's how we're going to have our Snowden effect, is everyone needs to know how special we are. We also need a screening and attribute process around this. I mean, this isn't to isolate people, but I think it's to put people into parts of our industry where they can play to their strengths. We also need to look at how we deal with stress and neutralizing the traits that actually will see someone have a stress-induced event. For me, and my own experience, a lot of that comes down to time and effort management. But I think that will vary from case to case. So I think commercial necessity has meant that we've taken an approach that probably doesn't necessarily mean that we're fit for purpose. And hopefully this is no longer the case. History's shown us that we've been able to evolve in the past as well as devolve in the case of health. But I think this will be a case where hopefully over the next few years we'll see training and certification evolve down a very different path. We've seen communities start to drive this. Hopefully some of the little examples I've given as well in terms of training and education I've presented can drive you down this path. And hopefully this is really sparking more questions than answers on paths and approaches to explore. Folks, if you have any questions, that's the best way to get a hold of me. But yeah, I thank you for coming to AusCERT, and I'm happy to open up to any questions.
We didn't have any questions come through the app, but I did have one. So this is specific to penetration testing. You're mentioning things like practical exercises, gamification, all that sort of stuff. CEH is definitely the black sheep of the pen testing certifications, but we do have quite a few ones that I think are quite a bit better. So OSCP, Offensive Security Certified Professional, basically does have a CTF as the way to learn, and then it has a practical exam where you have to go and hack effectively. We've got EJPT, Ethical Junior Penetration Tester, which is a similar one, but instead of a 24-hour exam, it's 6 hours. So I was just wondering if you'd be able to talk about those and whether or not they're effective in your eyes, or?
Yeah, look, definitely. A good chunk of my staff have gone through the OSCP and also the CREST CRT as well, but that's more of a certification. I think my concern isn't so much the certification, but what's the supporting environment where we cultivate these people? Because you can get an OSCP off the street, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you've been trained in how a wider cybersecurity practice operates. You look at the same thing with our blue teams, right? You have to enter a sizable defensive team. You have to learn off each other and work in that team space. And I think our certification environment doesn't cater to that necessarily. So is there a path with which we can build the team play into our certs? So, but yeah, they are effective. There's just more that can be done.
Just to stir up some drama, what do you think of CRT?
No, CRT is an effective baseline certification. I should also note I am also a CREST member and on the board as well. It is effective, but I think it does come back to there needs to be a supporting environment that also gets certified as well and recognised to generate that capability, as opposed to here is a certification. I think that total systems approach is going to give us a better quality, employees, but also better quality outcomes from organisations.
As a CRT, I've got my own opinions on that, but anyway.
We'll have a beer after this.
Cheers. So thank you very much for speaking. So here's your speaker gift. Were there any other questions from anyone in the audience?
Oh no, Eric's put his hand up.
I've got serious questions. Thanks. I saw a throwaway comment, I think it was by Swift on security on Twitter, and it was if you want to get into cybersecurity, it's really easy. You just need to work on the help desk for 7 years, which kind of is kind of, I find myself sort of cry laughing at that, because it's kind of spot on the money. But one of the problems we have is in a lot of these things, is there any opportunities with what you're talking about to speed up the process of getting, because a lot of the things you've described could easily be done if you have the benefit of time to spend years and years, giving someone an apprenticeship and working them through. But is there anything that you've seen that can short circuit that, or is even me asking the question problematic?
Look, I think it comes back to a whole of life thing, right? To me, I agree with the notion of take time and build yourself over that period, and I come back to that sort of inward introspection. I think a lot of people here have already gone on that journey and are the beneficiaries of it, whereas I think even beyond those technical skills, I think there's and if you look throughout history, which is kind of why I dropped that history piece in the middle here, throughout history we've seen the necessity of growing those skills over several years. Not just from a technical skill set standpoint, but also from a mentality and emotional maturity standpoint. If we, it's like having a 22-year-old management consultant with an MBA. The absence of experience isn't really going to be productive to us. And I would also question if anyone's going to take that person seriously without that experience. And I'd even say the same could be said. Someone jumping straight into a pen testing role with no demonstrated experience, there's exceptions to it. Certainly folks that have actually gone off and done practical research are that case, but someone jumping into some of these roles with none of that background experience, I think will will struggle to function. So I think that time thing, I think we view it as a negative, whereas I think delaying that gratification can actually be a good thing. So, interesting question. I think there were 2 other questions down here. Yeah, thanks, Eric.
Thank you. It's been mentioned in a few talks, the shortage of cyber staff. And we're talking about this time to become a cyber professional. It's being quite long. And when I think about my role, I'm a security engineer at a large university. It's quite broad.
Yep.
And I think part of the proceduralisation, the belt slide effect of learning is because of how broad our sector has become. We touch every single department in IT.
Yep.
How do you build that broad base of comprehension, build that Socratic rhetoric, which I think is a great point, by the way, efficiently in order to be able to provide people in time for what the industry and what we currently require?
I think this idea of very quick and efficient problem-solving skills is where we want to drive. I talked, if you did my threat modelling game as well, one of the points I talked about is, hit me up, I'll send you a deck, one of the points I talk about is threat models are useless, but the art of threat modelling is invaluable. What we're trying to do here is, train the thought process and have people so that they're actually ideating on these things, so that when they are thrown into a scenario with little knowledge or limited awareness, they've got in their own mind their own process that will actually allow them to adapt and overcome. Whereas I think the idea of, to your point, of spending 6 years having slides belt fed, can be risky, especially in terms of being able to recall that knowledge. So I think if we are looking more towards the problem solving skills and the capacity to troubleshoot, that's going to set us up more for success. And then over time, people will learn on the job as opposed to having everything loaded into them already. So, yeah, good question.
How you going? Just a quick one. For someone that's relatively new to cybersecurity, there's so many variety of options in terms of training, certification. How do you go about choosing the right path, or which one do I do first, or which one do I do last? Is there a way to approach it?
There's no real, great question. There's no real set routine. I mean, the best guidance I could give you is from my own experience. So when I was 16, 17, 18 during high school, I did programming and absolutely loved it. But by the time I got to university, I absolutely hated it because it was, here is requirement stock, build to requirement stock. And it lacked that creativity. And then I went down the network engineering path, which also saw me start off on a help desk role. And then as I had that experience, at that level 1 point, it's like, okay, what am I interested in? A part of me was interested in networking. Another part of me was starting to get interested in security because we were starting to have issues and events at that time. So I think for me, you will find strengths and weaknesses as you progress through your career, and also, hey, this is something I like doing. This is the path I want to pursue. And that will become quite evident. There was a pen tester I used to work with who suddenly fell in love with DFIR on a job which I think was a pen test that turned into an instant response, and they've never looked back. So I think those are going to be your paths that will take you down that road throughout your life. Is you'll work out, hey, this is something I like, this is something I hate, and follow through on that gut feel.
Just so you know, we are breaking for lunch, but if you're still happy to keep taking questions.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, well, folks, thanks again. If you want to cut away for lunch, I understand. I'm probably a little bit more important than food. Yes. So otherwise, I'm happy to stay up here. I've got a bottle of water and I'm already well fed. So thanks for coming. Enjoy AusCERT. I'll be around. Feel free to reach out. Thanks again.
The nose.